Hello and welcome. We are back with another episode of Global Ideas, an initiative by Hong Kong Baptist University to bring some of the finest minds together to help us understand some of the complex challenges of our times. The focus of this season of Global Ideas is to explore what is called the new Cold War. Now, an important element of the old Cold War was propaganda. But what about the new Cold War? How should we understand propaganda, especially in the age of transforming technology across the globe and changing geopolitics? So to answer some of the most pertinent questions related to propaganda and the new Cold War, we couldn't have asked for a better guest than one joining us today, right now on the screen, all the way from Tokyo, Professor Nancy Snow. Let me introduce her. Yeah, we'll have a proper introduction, but we can clap, of course. Professor Nancy Snow is a renowned propaganda studies and public diplomacy scholar. She is a distinguished professor of public diplomacy at Kyoto University of Foreign Studies in Japan. She is also a adjunct fellow in the Institute of Contemporary Asian Studies at Temple University, Japan. Last year, she held the Walt Disney Faculty Chair in Global Media at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University in Beijing. She is a Professor Emeritus of Communications, California State University, Fullerton. Some of her widely acclaimed books include Information War, American Propaganda, Free Speech, and Opinion Control Since 9/11, Japan's Information War, and Propaganda and American Diplomacy. Professor Nancy Snow is also known as Dr. Persuasion, given her work on the topic, but interestingly shares in her book, Important for Professors, and I quote, "One student exclaimed with a smile that she was forever sorry for having taken one of my classes because I had her reading the newspaper and following the goings-on in Washington." So we have a professor for whom really there's nothing out of syllabus. Professor Nancy Snow, welcome to Global Ideas.
Thank you very much. Wow, what an introduction.
All right.
I don't even need my coffee now.
And now we have our in-house experts. Professor Daya Thusu is with us. Professor Daya Thusu is a renowned global scholar of international communication. He's widely known for his extensive publications in the field of communication. He's the founder and managing editor of the Sage journal, Global Media and Communication. He has authored or edited 20 books and still working on the 21st one. Professor Thusu has been a distinguished visiting professor and inaugural Disney chair at Schwarzman College, Tsinghua University, Beijing, and currently teaches at the Hong Kong Baptist University here in Hong Kong. Professor Thusu, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we also have, last but not the least, Mr. Vincent Wong with us. Mr. Wong is a former bureaucrat currently doing PhD at HKBU. He has 25 years of industry experience and is considered a pioneer in promoting solution journalism in Asia. He has an MBA and LLB from the prestigious University of Cambridge and Imperial College, University of London, respectively. Welcome, Vincent.
Thank you for having me, and thank you, Anilesh, for facilitating this interesting conversation.
All right, so let's start the session. And the first question is to our guest in Tokyo, Professor Snow. Tell us something about the new Cold War. Are you reading about it in the newspapers? You follow global media very, very closely. How do you make sense of this phrase, the new Cold War?
You know, it concerns me because as a propaganda scholar, I'm always mindful of the either or, the dichotomies, the us versus them. That's really been part of my study and even working at a propaganda agency right after I got my PhD. So Cold War, of course, US, USSR, and then there was a victor, ostensibly, the United States, but that didn't last long. And it's almost like we miss having a rival. And to some analysts, we need a bipolar type competition in order to work better together. I'm not so sure if that's true, but yeah, of course, we're talking now predominantly from where I sit about US and China or Japan and China. And the ongoing tensions there, the hot rhetoric, the more aggressive maneuvers, both economically, militarily, trade wars. But on par, though, to the average person, and I include myself, I'm not in the government, I'm an academic just looking at this and writing about it. I wrote a piece earlier this year at the time I was speaking at the China Development Forum, and it was for the Nikkei Asia. And I said, you know, my hope is that we won't make China the new sort of cancel culture, because it's easy to do that. It's easy to demonize an entire country, and it's still made up of, you know, 1.6 billion people. You know, it's a large population. So do we really want to do that? And you can't really compare it to the old Cold War because of the difference today with the technology and the new media and the fast-paced nature of all of this. Our brains aren't even able to tackle.
Professor Snow, hold that thought. You mentioned two very important things. You mentioned China, you mentioned technology. We will have a country-specific discussion, but let's start with a broader idea of the new Cold War, and I'd like to bring Professor Thusu in here. Now, Professor Thusu, the term propaganda itself, generally it is seen associated with authoritarian regimes, right? Democracies, somehow they work around it, somehow they maneuver around it. Why do democracies get away by using propaganda but disguised as persuasion?
Actually, that's not, thank you, that's not a fully accurate description, because if you look at any standard textbook on propaganda, you know, its origins are in Catholic faith. Way back in the, 11th century, Pope Urban II. So we got to use propaganda, information management to fight the Crusades, right? And subsequently, the Catholic Church created a formal institution for propagating faith, right? So it's a very long history. But even in modern context and in a democratic context, if you look at the word propaganda was used, for instance, in political science departments in the 1920s and 30s in the United States. It was actually a positive concept. It wasn't like it is today in China, right? So it is the Cold War, and even before that, sorry, it was the Nazi regime, and it's very successful use of the medium of the day, namely radio, that propaganda got a very bad name. And therefore, there was a kind of intellectual project to distance democracies from the notion of propaganda. Propaganda was what the authoritarian regimes did. Stalin did it, Mao did it, and Hitler did it. But democracies do persuasion. And that's also to be seen in the context of the whole public relations industry, how it normalizes something which can be deeply political, but it is presented in a manner that it looks persuasive. And I have to be careful when I'm speaking in front of Dr. Persuasion. So, but that's how I would see it. I think that this bit of historical context is important to keep in mind. And so therefore it is this distinction between one of the things I wrote many years ago. I was talking about BBC versus Voice of America, right? In context of the Cold War, and I used the phrase, BBC does what Voice of America has been doing, but this is propaganda in gentlemanly tones, right? That's the phrase I used. So I think it is. It's a question of how you formulate it, but the history is very much there, and I think we shouldn't lose sight of that, because essentially what you're trying to do, you're trying to frame a narrative in a particular way, especially in the relation of in international relations context, and therefore if you're in a more sophisticated information environment, as Western democracies are, United States particularly, it can be projected as persuasion. But in my view, it is, it's a more sophisticated form of propaganda.
Right. So, but before we go to Vincent has a very important question. I would like to throw that to Professor Snow. How would you describe the propaganda coming from authoritarian regimes versus democratic countries or democratic setup? Professor Snow?
I specialize in propaganda in a democracy, specifically the United States. And I've said on many occasions that the most propagandistic country in the world is the United States. So I do think, though, there is this misnomer, though, this associating propaganda with strictly authoritarian societies makes us sort of stuck in our thinking, because we tend to then look at democracies as the white hats, that we engage in the truth or persuasion using rhetoric and argumentation to get your point across. But in terms of industries and big tech in particular, which I'm sort of on my crusade now, to use another sort of propaganda term, against big tech companies and their influence, institutionally, is there anything comparable to the US? And yet I hear from my friends at the State Department and even in the White House, they don't want to associate with propaganda. And they say that, I was listening to a forum on the what used to be the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and there was a representative from Capitol Hill, and she was saying, we don't do propaganda, we tell the truth. And you hear news people say the same thing. But it's sort of, you get belly laughs in response to that, because in my trajectory of working at USIA and the State Department under the Clinton administration, and then post 9/11 beginning to write a lot more about propaganda, it was so often the case when I was talking to an international group that the question would arise, how come you Americans are so good at propagandizing yourselves and your own messages, and yet you're not very effective with your propaganda on us? We're on the receiving end of it, but we can see right through it that it's your own self-interest, that it is not based on a balanced sort of back and forth conversation that you might have in persuasion, but rather that it really is going to favor the national interests of the US. So, I mean, people overseas are often really quite aware of being on, carpet bombed by a lot of this propaganda. And a lot of it comes in the form of entertainment, of course.
Yes.
And if you all know Alex Carey's work, Taking the Risk Out of Democracy, he says that the propaganda's highest achievement in the 20th century was convincing us, and it was the United States predominantly, that we weren't engaged in propaganda. And that was really coming out of the business community. And so that in itself was a very successful propaganda campaign to sort of make ourselves rise above. One last point I'll make. We saw this play out right after the Biden administration, the inauguration took place. You saw the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense come over to East Asia and do the moralizing with China and the assertive tone, and that we are going to promote our democratic values because really they're superior. And they wrote an op-ed in the Post to this point. But it fell flat. It may have worked. The op-ed in the Post worked for the American reader. Yeah, you go. But to the Chinese, all they wanted to do was push back to that, because they said, okay, if you're going to play your hardball rhetorically with us, we're going to give it right back to you. So where does that really get us in terms of this new Cold War?
Yes. Can I pick it up on that, Professor Snow? I think you
Sure.
delve deep into this subject, particularly in your handbook of propaganda. And right now, I think even for the United States, there is a saying that there are facts, truth, or even alternative facts and alternative truth. So propaganda is really in action within the United States and around the world as well. But going back to what you have just said, and that China has pushed back like never before, how propaganda controls human psyche today with technology, social media, and all that. How do you see that with the new technological changes? Can you give us some examples?
Well, I think just the way that we utilize the new technology, we're hearing more about this now, the sort of addictive aspects, the tendency to kind of get into this tunnel vision, this orientation that we have to sort of listen to those voices with which we already agree. We don't generally go online or use our phones and scroll through to get contrasting points of view or dissenting points of view from our own, because that just makes us angry. I mean, we really want to have a shared sense of purpose. And so we end up engaging in competing propagandas, if you will. So we see that with the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, or say, was January 6, 2021, was that an insurrection, or was that just a peaceful protest with a few outliers, or were there FBI plants? I mean, you can get all different competing narratives there. And I don't know what the truth is, because I wasn't there. And even if I had been there on the ground, would I have known the truth? I mean, I may have known what was happening in my immediate vicinity, but we're so reliant and dependent on industries now, whether, you know, it's sponsored groups, even I would argue the way that Black Lives Matter played out in many respects had propaganda aspects to it, because people quickly were putting black squares on Instagram. There wasn't any great dialogical back and forth about what does this mean, you know, but it was something that people just did knee jerk because everybody else was doing it. And they thought if they don't do it, they'll be labeled racist, and you don't want to get that label. That's like being labeled communist.
But an important question is, and I want to bring Professor Tusu in here. Professor Tusu, if you have to do some sort of comparison between the old Cold War and new Cold War, and Professor Snow started her remarks by saying she absolutely disapproves of this binary between US and China. But the fact is, in the old Cold War, there were a lot of pro-Western sentiments, spread by the American elite. So can you give us that historical perspective? And what happens to that pro-Western perspective today? And who is propagating that? So we'll come to Professor Snow, but Professor Tusu first.
Thank you. I think it is actually well documented. It has to be seen in the broader context of the whole information system, if you like, global media system, how think tanks, universities, Professor Snow worked for the US state, department, particularly working for global communication. So you had this kind of official propaganda channels. They didn't call it propaganda, but essentially it was propaganda, whether it was Voice of America, initially radio, and then later in later years television, but also more specific, country specific. I know we can talk about that later in more detail, but just to give you an example, for example, Radio Marti and then TV Marti was specifically aimed at Cuba. Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty were specifically aimed at Eastern Europe. And some of these were clandestine operations. They were not, they were run by intelligence agencies much later that they were regularized. In fact, after the Cold War, or just before, in fact. But so there's that kind of official network, right? Which the elite, the official elite is propagating, and there's actually no confusion about that. It is propaganda, and it is there to influence hearts and minds of people. So emotions are very important. But then there's also even more sophisticated, if you like, private corporate propaganda, or persuasion, if you prefer. So you could argue that New York Times or Time magazine, which represent elite journalism, not just in the United States, but given US influence and power globally. So if you're on the cover of Time magazine, you are a story yourself, right? There's no say that powerful. So one of the reasons it was so, in my view, so effective was because there was this very interesting convergence between private corporate media, professional private corporate media, and state apparatus. Just imagine if the United States only was using its official sources to influence people in rest of the world, it would be as bad as the the Soviet Union did, or what the Chinese are doing today, right? The reason so elite was very sophisticated in that sense. Again, you have to think of, as I said at the beginning, the sense of how the whole information infrastructure was created, whether it is the public relations industry and political PR, and how that worked in very close association with think tanks, universities, government, and corporate interests. I don't think there is a better example of that than the United States. And it isn't surprising that it was so effective. And I would argue is in today's more complicated information economy, still very effective. And if you think of who the big players are, we talked about social media earlier, they are all without exception major American companies. Right. So one could argue that the influence has grown so much more because in the First World War we were talking to the elite essentially. Today Facebook has 2 billion subscribers. If it was a country, it would be bigger than it was the largest country in the world. So just imagine the battle for control of minds and emotions. The platform power is phenomenal.
What would be the equivalent of the American elites from the old Cold War in this day and age? Who are the elite, who are powerful, who have control over propaganda or message coming from the United States? As Professor Tusu argues, it is the Facebooks of the United States. Do you agree with that?
Oh, yes. I mean, absolutely. Has anybody else on this call been to the Facebook headquarters? I may be the only one. And I was there in March of 2019 in a room with about 12 people to discuss countering global misinformation campaigns. And I was brought there as an academic because of my specialty. But guess who else was in the room? Maria Ressa of Rappler, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, she has become the biggest critic of Facebook. And yet, what was she doing in the room? Well, because Facebook now dominates so much in developing countries. And we may not think about this. We go out and get our latest iPhone, many of us in our circles. But in many parts of the world, your phone, you can't afford the internet service. And so Facebook, through its Free Basics initiative, would offer free internet, but you had to use Facebook as your launch app. And for many of these poor people who didn't know better, they just used Facebook for their news and information. So originally, Rappler was a Facebook page. And it really took off, and Facebook sort of co-opted Rappler and put kind of its like a good housekeeping seal from Facebook. But ultimately, even Maria, Ressa could clearly see that Facebook is not being responsible. So we are all really beholden to these companies, and it's been a dramatic rise. I think the membership is 3 billion now. I mean, I don't know what's a billion or two, but I mean, you're right. The economies of scale. I mean, nobody can really compete with that. And what it does, it creates a lot of cognitive dissonance, because now in the COVID era, we all have this need to connect online. And so as much as I'm really loathing of Facebook as a platform and also a media company, I'm still on Facebook. So I'm kind of grappling with that. What do I do? Because I want to get information out about what I'm doing. So yeah, the elites back in the day would have been giving their speeches or being featured on the cover of Time. Now, occasionally, those same elites may go before Congress, but Congress, their hands are tied, really, the US Congress, because so far they haven't broken up these companies. They don't have a means to do that, even though the public can see we don't like monopolies. We did that once with our telephone companies and the railroads, but are we going to really have the public will to do it with telecommunications? And I think we have to. It's just a matter of time, because we're not being well informed either. So many of those, the New York Times, they're not really adding reporters, and most of my students I've taught in communications over the year are not going into journalism. They're going into entertainment industries or PR. That's where the growth is. So I would say, it looks very different today. But again, there's also this tribalism at play as well, because you have Facebook, a lot of those tech companies, they lean more left. And so when they do go after misinformation, conservatives and people to the right of center say this is unfair. They're really picking on us, or those of us who are, promoting some type of conspiracy now, the anti-vaxxers, whatever it may be. So they sort of cherry pick their issues.
All right, go ahead, Vincent.
Yes, I would like to follow up on that, because some people would argue the other way around. They would even say that let's say in the form of soft power rather than the word propaganda, because there is a distinguish between facts, truth, and propaganda, but there's also a distinguish between soft power and propaganda, like Hollywood or what we have just talked about, the Western media. So some people or even scholars argue that soft power contributes positively in relationship building among countries, and therefore we should differentiate between bad propaganda and good propaganda, while others may argue that this is possibly some hegemony framing of mind. What is your view on that, Professor Snow and Professor Tusu?
Well, I'm just going to say briefly that I included a chapter in the new Rutledge Handbook of Public Diplomacy called Exchanges as Good Propaganda. And I was writing about US exchange programs, but if you wanted to compare it to China, I mean, they certainly look at exchanges in the context of their propaganda spectrum, or if you want to use a more neutral term, exchange diplomacy. But the students whom I've known, the Chinese students who go abroad, will tell me, we go with a sort of national interest purpose. We know that. That's really been inculcated in us. And I said, oh yeah, that's what American students do too when they go abroad. No, it's very individualistic. What we used to say in the Fulbright program was, it changed my life. So it was very much about something that looked good on your CV, would help you get into a better grad school. And that was the case for me as well. I think we could separate out, if I were looking at the US case, the soft power or the better propaganda programs, the ones that even were, documentary films that sort of show the whole landscape of a problem. Edward R. Murrow had a hard time with The Harvest of Shame, which became a documentary program many of us are aware of about migrant workers in America. And when he became director of USIA, he put on his propaganda cap and said to himself, now that's a film that airs our dirty laundry. I don't want that to be shown overseas. So when his friend from the BBC said, we want to air The Harvest of Shame, Murrow said, nah, but they ended up airing it nevertheless. So I think one of our greatest assets in the US is that airing of one's dirty laundry. I mean, very recently, I was told by a friend that when she saw the images of the protests and even some of the violence taking place after the murder of George Floyd, and the way that that played out without a total sort of firing up of the entire society made her think that the democracy in the US was stronger than I even viewed it, because I was there watching it every day on TV. But she thought it was a strength of American democracy that people could shout out and shout back at the government and at the police and at the governors. That was seen as an example. But we're seeing, though, internationally, where autocratic societies are growing, democracies are weakening. So I don't know really if we're the best model anymore.
Professor Thuso, if I can ask you to share your opinion on soft power propaganda, and particularly the point that Professor Snow mentions about this self-critique being projected as a signature of open society, a sign of open society. How do you see that?
But I mean, it's a fact that United States remains a very open society, as does a lot of Western Europe, for various reasons: cultural, political, historical. There's no dispute on that front. And I would argue the mainstream media also is, aware of that self-criticism, and some of the finest work on US propaganda excesses have been done by American scholars, and you got one in the discussion now. So the point I wanted to make about soft power is also, again, a bit of history is important. Where does the concept come from, and why does it emerge at a particular juncture in history? Professor Joseph Nye, who was at Harvard at that time, he writes an article in Foreign Policy Journal in 1990. And the timing is interesting. It's the end of the Cold War, it's triumph of capitalism, triumph of the United States. And that triumph was achieved arguably by a very skillful combination of soft power as well as hard power, right? And Professor Nye later wrote in one of his many publications that US domination it varies from Harvard to Hollywood. And there has been a lot of work done to show that arguably Hollywood was more influential in ending the Cold War than was the nuclear, policies and all the bombs that they created and deployed all over the world. So I think that timing is interesting, and it's also a reflection of the domination of US discourse around the world, that this idea of soft power becomes very, very, gains a currency which is unheard of. Within 10 years, every major government has a public diplomacy division in the foreign office, foreign ministries. There is this whole sub kind of industry of nation branding. There are journals dedicated to nation branding, and it's this kind of mini industry which has emerged and has strengthened since then. The other point I wanted to make in relation to that is more recently, say in the last 4 years, a new concept has emerged, the concept of sharp power. And that is identified with certain countries, China, Russia, for example, to name the two major ones. And the prognosis of this concept is quite interesting. So it actually emerges from a report published in 2017 by a very influential think tank in the United States. Within days of this report being out, there are editorials in The Economist, in the Washington Post, in New York Times, in Foreign Policies. So it becomes an acceptable phrase. It doesn't actually mean very much. It's an intelligent way of kind of framing the debate, but actually it does. So I'll just quote you how they define it. Sharp power is defined. What sharp power does is it pierces, penetrates, and perforates the political and information environment in the targeted countries. As if United States doesn't do that, or Europeans don't do that, right?
Sure.
So this is an argument which can be, easily contested, but given the influence and power, that's what I was saying earlier also, this kind of interconnections between think tanks, mainstream media, universities, and including social media now, that becomes the common sense argument that China is a sharp power, United States is a soft power.
Mhm.
Right?
Mhm.
And actually, the United States is the most powerful country in hard power terms. Of course, it's got
Yeah.
substantial soft power too. There's no dispute about that. But it is taken that seriously, not because of its soft power, but because of its economy, which is biggest in the world by any measure in comparison to the competitors, right?
But going back to the question of propaganda, and we had this one of the episodes with Mr. Einar Tangen, who is a well-known political and economic affairs commentator, and you would always see him defending China on various global media platforms. So he said something interesting, Professor Snow, and I would like you to respond to that. He said, well, Chinese are very bad at propaganda, quite contrary to what or how it is seen in different parts of the world. And I asked this question to Professor Tusu as well, and he said, well, they need better storytelling skills. So because you have worked in the US government, you were a part of the team whose job was to spread the American idea. How do you analyze Chinese propaganda? Good or bad, effective, non-effective? What is your analysis?
As I thought about this, I really think with China that perhaps the propaganda has been very effective domestically. And I'm assuming he's referring more in terms of internationally. It comes across as a bit heavy-handed and clunky. And that doesn't mean the US hasn't been there too. We've seen most recently with Afghanistan, the whole explanation of that debacle, which I think will, in terms of just image and reputation, will be with the United States for years and may never really bring us back to a certain level of respectability. So, but I like the idea of more storytellers. And with China and the US, sometimes they get caught up in quantity over quality. And I've had many a conversation, both here in Japan or when I was able to get into China, about one friend of mine in China said, gosh, we're a little bit envious of Japan because they don't seem to spend all that much on public diplomacy and propaganda, but everybody seems to love Japan. And I said, well, that certainly helped by the peace brand and the fact that the US occupied Japan and created the Constitution of Japan and defanged Japan and took away the power of the sun god emperor. There were a lot of elements that went into that. And now the Japanese are very proud when I talk about a peace brand, but that's a propaganda element too to Japanese society. So yeah, China keeps pouring a lot of revenue into this, but when the world sort of receives it or reads about China, it's often in the context of it's overblown or, the wolf warrior, which again was like the equivalent to shark power. I mean, it's been kind of out there as a meme now, and it's meme trafficking across the world. But I think that if you let the people speak more for themselves, and I've said the same about Japan, that takes some of the sting, some of the taint of propaganda away, because we are on this search for more authenticity. And with storytelling, it's not often based in facts. It's a good story. It's a good yarn. It's something that you can imagine sitting at the knee of grandpa, growing up, or being a Girl Scout and sitting around the campfire and hearing a good story. So we need better communicators, in other words. And but in order to do that, you have to be better at listening and observing and empathizing and understanding where people are coming from, and not being so quick to do as George W. Bush did right after the attacks of 9/11. He said, we've got to do a better way of explaining ourselves. You know, he made it immediately about the US, that somehow the world hadn't heard enough from us. And so we had to explain even more. Well, you know, the world had heard a lot, and it would have been a very different tone had he said, we have to better understand the world. But that's not really what a lot of the American people wanted to hear. They wanted revenge.
That's a brilliant point. That's a very good point. And Vincent, are we hearing really a lot about the United States from the United States?
I think the point about storytelling is that there are different types of stories as well. And some countries are better at telling hero stories. And some countries may be better at telling scary tales. So I think when I read Dr. Snow or Professor Snow's book, she mentioned that propaganda efforts are expanding possibly at the highest speed today in the United States, and definitely I think in China, where she just also pointed out. Is it a competition? Could you elaborate one or two reasons behind this rapid expansion, or is it a new sort of soft powers or storytelling arms race even?
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. I believe with that comment, if I can recall the full context of it, it does go back to technology. And I'm highly influenced by other scholars, including, of course, Jacques Ellul and propaganda, and where he would talk about you can't really have propaganda unless you have a country that has, you know, either centralized media or advanced technologies, which are really, you know, that's what we have now today. We have ever increasing applications and ways of gathering information, but there is this sameness to it, as Professor Tusu mentioned with the sharp power, how quickly that propagated across the respectable media. And then that became kind of fixed in people's ideas of, oh, that's how I need to look at the world now. So then you hear students using that term, but we don't really define it or disagree or get into debate about, well, what does that really look like? And that's because we're just gathering information, but we're losing context and we're losing contemplative time, or at least I feel that I am. So much of the way that I understand the world and that I write about observations are driven by my own sort of personal relationship with my environment. So I usually kind of bring my voice into it. And sometimes it's just an opinion that that this technology is so much ahead of our ability to really adapt to it, that I really worry about what's happening to our ability to interact as human beings. Are we capable of really having credible face-to-face communication where we don't go to fisticuffs? I mean, you know, I'm thinking again about my home country that is an open society, but it's also sort of losing its way in terms of people not wanting to hear from something that is counter to their point of view without getting upset, you know. And I've just never experienced it so at this degree in my life. And so I have to attribute that in part to the rise of a lot of the social media and technology. And that's what I think came out with the Facebook whistleblower sort of engaging in that, even though she was focused predominantly on youth. But I think that was a technique, a way to get us to examine ourselves at an adult level.
Yeah, can I follow up on that? Even for the storytelling of the internet or the social media, we also see the differences. I think in the United States is about Facebook, Twitter. We are talking about technology giants or even startup is an engine for future growth. Whereas in China, it is a tool for a giant marketplace. November 11th that's coming up is the highest spending single day for China. And also a tool for actually managing public health. We see that in COVID-19. So we are looking at very different stories. And for the Europeans, the internet is more about privacy and all that. So from your perspective, with the development of 5G technology recently, how do you see the government use propaganda techniques to control dissent domestically and also promote themselves externally? Professor Snow and Professor Tusu?
Well, I would let Professor Tusu maybe answer that first.
Yes, Professor.
What was your experience like when you were holding the Disney chair? Because you were there for a year. And my understanding was that your life was in the phone, right? Everything was about the phone.
Contrary to popular belief, I am not very much in the digital space. I just use my email to communicate and very sparingly use my phone, as my friends and colleagues would know. But the experience in, just to respond to your question, was very different in the sense that it was a American elite college. It was a kind of bubble within the Chinese university. So you had access to everything. Google, Facebook, etc., etc. The moment you step out of the building, of course, a different universe. But the point I wanted to make about that, in response to what Vincent asked, in terms of how do you deal with the domestic, how do you create a kind of acceptance of a particular narrative? And there's a very beautiful phrase that Walter Lippmann, who wrote a very important book about propaganda, had, which was coined in 1922. It was called manufacturing consent. How do you create agreement in a democratic society where he's talking specifically the United States context, where there are all kinds of problems and inequalities and all kinds of issues in a society, open society, debating society. And it's interesting that that phrase was then borrowed by Noam Chomsky and Edward Herman in their famous 1988 book, which is actually a very interesting book about propaganda. And the book is called Manufacturing Consent. And they acknowledge that the phrase they've taken is from Lippmann. So in a democratic system, it is interesting how you you frame the debate in a particular context, in the sense that there are certain areas that are okay, you can talk about them, there's no problem. But then there is a kind of a boundary. If you're talking beyond that, that's sort of, one scholar has called it the sphere of deviance. That's something which is not to be discussed in polite conversation or serious scholarship or serious journalism. And I think that's been a very successful approach. And therefore, they have managed dissent in a very, very sophisticated way. And if you contrast that with what, for example, China has done in that, there couldn't be more striking difference. And as a result, Chinese narratives, whether it's on social media or in mainstream, legacy media, or in entertainment field, think of TikTok, for instance, which is a Chinese company, is not been as effective. And it is, it's also interesting to just kind of final thing to say on this is that although the major Western social media networks are banned in China, Facebook, Twitter, etc., but both Chinese government and Chinese corporations are using them to communicate to the world. It's quite an interesting irony that domestically you can't access these platforms, but you can see CGT and China Daily and the Chinese official spokesman using Twitter handle to talk to the world. And that's an interesting difference from the previous Cold War we had, where none of this existed. So it was a very limited means of communication. Today, it has become far more complicated and therefore much more interesting as scholars for us.
You know, I'm a huge fan of Lippmann, and I've often referenced that book, Public Opinion, which really is the classic text for
Sure.
the founding communications programs. And remember, he refers to the masses as the bewildered herd, that the masses you really can't rely on because we're so prone to emotional impulses. We're sort of flighty, not very reliable. You know, we see the little shiny bauble and we get distracted. So his prescription then was that you need the scientific industrial elites, you know,
Yes.
to manage this. And in a way, maybe that's what China's doing by they don't allow the Facebook and the Twitter for the masses because they're irresponsible, but we're going to use those companies to get our message out because we're trained, we're efficient, we're effective. And that's where you get the, you know, the elites that we know are in China, despite a lot of the rhetoric of equality. So I think they've taken some pages out of Lippmann's book and put it to work.
All right, we're almost running out of time. So last question, Professor Snow, to give us a summary. How do you see the future of this new Cold War? Where do you see it is going?
Well, the other thing that I get on my high horse about is exchanges. And this is a tough one because when I think of exchange programs and exchange of persons, I worked in the academic exchanges division and was a Fulbright desk officer. And I know Fulbright, like Schwartzman, it's very elite level, but I would love to see in 5 years, as we sort of learn to live with this coronavirus and manage it better, that we increase exchanges across the board. We make them more accessible. The way that countries now are dealing with inequality issues economically, there's inequality in exchanges too. It's still very, very elite to participate in study abroad. But there's nothing, I think, quite like getting outside your comfort zone, both in language and culture, seeing different norms, and also hopefully having some engagement where it can be civic and respectful, but also where you can learn something. There's a takeaway to it. So I think when it comes to China, the world just really doesn't know China. I think China's sent, of course, you know, so many Chinese students around the world, and they are informers to China when they return. Most of them do to China. So there's a comparative advantage that China has knowing the world and maybe not always managing its relations with the world, but we need to know China better. We need to know Russia better. We need to know those countries that are often our competitors at best, but are, you know, enemies at worst, because without that, I don't really have a whole great deal of optimism about where we're going to be 5 years from now.
Thank you very much. And if you were sitting in a global parliament, I would have said, to all those in the favor of knowing more about the world, say aye, and I'm sure everyone will agree to that. This is also the view that Professor Suso has held for long. But thank you very much, Professor Snow, for
You're
taking
very
our time.
welcome. Thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed it. It went by like that.
Thank you very
Thank you
much.
very much, Vincent. Thank you very much, Professor Susu.
Thank
And
you.
thank you to all the people watching online. Please stay tuned. We'll be back with more. Stay safe and goodbye.
Again, Nilesh.